Afternoon from here. This is International Master Oladapo, and it's been a minute. I've been a little busy, but I'm back to continue with the candidates that has been going on. I think they're in they've played a couple of games, a couple of rounds so far. So here I'm about to review the second round for the open section. This was a round that was pretty much, we could say, the blood round, because every game was decisive in this round. The first game, the first round, they were still filling out each other, and for this round, they decided to take it up a notch to let everybody know they are there for business. So the first game we're going to check out today is the game Gukesh Prague. You would think that the Indians actually they're going to be nice to each other, but really that's not the case. It's like everybody's out for blood. It doesn't matter if you're from the same country or you bear the same name, or it doesn't matter what. So they are all out to get the spot, to be to see who's going to qualify to play the world champion, the Glaring of China. Okay, so let's get started. This is a game between Prague and Gukesh. These are two very promising. I don't know if I should use the word promising, or maybe I should say promised, because these are two of the top players in the world right now, and I think they actually. I don't even think they are below 20. They are under 20, and they also make the crux of one of the strong Indian teams. So let's see what happened in this game. Prague was on the white side. So Prague opened with the move d4. Now, Prague is someone that could play both e4 and d4. He's done this so many times. And this just shows you how prepared, these players are. So d4, d5, d5 can never be wrong. C4, e6. So we're going to the Queen's Gambit declined. Decline being that instead of capturing on c4, Black decides to play e6 to protect the pawn on d5, making sure he has a pawn in the central squares. Now, instead of the move e6, c6 is another possible move. But if c6 was played in this move instead of the move e6, this would be the Slav defense. So let's keep going. Knight f3, white develops his knight to the most active square, keeping an eye on the e5 square. Now, we'll always have to remember this. Sometimes we take this for granted. Every time a move is made, you always have to know why the move is made. What are you getting from that move? If we could do that for every move we make, it's going to be hard to make mistakes. So let's keep going. Knight f6 develops to knight to f6. G3. Now, by moving the pawn to g3, white is pretty much saying, you know what, I'm going to play the Catalan system. The Catalan system pretty much involves the pawns on d4, c4, knight on f3, g3, and then the bishop comes to g2. Now, the idea of the Catalan is to fianchetto the bishop to put a lot of pressure on this diagonal. And, taking the pawn on c4 is not such a good idea, because after that, this bishop really comes to life. And also, white has a lot of play, because now black doesn't have the control, as much control over the e4 square as earlier if he never captured the pawn on c4. So let's keep going. Bishop to b4 check, knight to c3, captures on c4. White simply bishop moves the bishop to g2. Like I said, the bishop is going to get very strong on this diagonal. So let's keep going. Castles, castles, knight to c6, a3. Trying to tell the bishop, hey, okay, what exactly are you going to be doing here? How long do you plan to stay here? So the bishop has to either take or move back. Now, taking is not such a good move, because by taking, the pawn takes back, the pawn is defended, and queen a4 can be played to win the pawn on c4. And then we have moves like rook e1, e4, e5, which is very, very strong for the white pieces. And of course, not to talk of the bishop coming to g5, putting pressure on this queen through the pin on the knight on f6. So let's keep going. After the move a3, bishop to e7 was played. e4, good move. Now, this is one of the reasons why the pawn was sacrificed on the c4. The c4 pawn was sacrificed to have this total control over the central squares. So let's see how well white was able to make this work. a6. What's the point of a6? Kind of obvious, to play b5. And b5 is a multi-purpose move. Apart from the fact that the pawn on b5 defends the pawn on c4, we have bishop to b7 also keeping an eye on this long diagonal, trying to counter the bishop on g2. So let's keep going. Bishop to e3. Now this move pretty much means I want to move my queen away, probably somewhere here to put pressure on this pawn without having to lose this pawn to the knight and the queen, because now I have the bishop on e3 and the knight on f3 protecting the pawn on d4. Now remember this, black is up a pawn, and for this, white has been able to get almost all its pieces in the game. So bishop to e3 was played. b5, yeah, that's exactly what I said earlier. The idea is to play b5, hold on to the c4 pawn, and it's not so much about holding on to the pawn, but I think that just comes alongside the idea, because the best square for the bishop on c8 is b7, not on d7. Definitely not blocking the queen. On b7, putting a lot of pressure on this long diagonal. And like I said earlier, trying to counter the bishop on g2. So let's keep going. Queen to e2, bishop to b7, rook a d1. That's an interesting move. It actually, in my mind, I thought maybe rook f d1 could have been played. I thought maybe rook f d1 would be a good idea. But actually, rook a d1 is more like it. Because looking at this position, the rook doesn't really have anything doing on the a file or the b file, not much on the c file. So the next file, the rook can actually have something to do is the d file. Meanwhile, the rook on f simply comes to the e file. So in case the e file gets opened up, the rook is ready to take some action. So let's keep going. Rook a d1, knight to a5. There's an immediate threat on the pawn on e4. That's one. The knight will come to b3. That's a good square, putting pressure on d4. And the good thing about this knight is it allows all black's pieces to have something doing, have some kind of target. So after the move knight to a5, d5 is played. You have to play um, d5. Another possibility for white here is to move the knight to e5. I actually like knight to e5 because with knight to e5, there are possibilities of, f4, f5, just trying to get a little aggressive and trying to cause some chaos in black's position. So d5 was played, captures on d5, e5. Now, this particular line has been played before. Actually, this is a game played between Hunger and Lawrence. This was in 2014. And in this position, uh, the black knight went to e8. And that's the same thing that happened in this game, knight to e8. Now, let's remember this. White is down 2 pawns. The first pawn was sacrificed on the c4 square. Now there's a second pawn that's been sacrificed on the d5 square. One thing about sacrifices is, at some point in time, if you get enough pawns, you actually can actually so I'm sorry, you can actually at some point either give a pawn back or even give a piece to get some more pawns. So all of a sudden, yes, you're down a piece, but you have a lot of activity for it. Looking at this position right now, this is what I'm talking about. Black has a6, b5, c4, d5, and c7. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns on the queen side against white's 2 pawns on the queen side. So black has 5 against 2. That's a huge 3 pawn advantage on the queen side. Even though white has 4 pawns against black's 3. It's important to start looking at the position this way. Because that way, like I said earlier, you can actually look for a opportunity to even sack a piece to get one more pawn. Now you have 4 pawns for just one piece, which is a big, big deal. 3 pawns is big enough, but to have 4 pawns, that means you have more than compensation for for being pieced down. So e5 was played, knight e8. Now e6. This is really, really aggressive, and I'm not surprised. This is how Prague plays. Prague looks for the sharpest line. I think this is his style. Maybe he always looks for the sharpest lines. He wants to keep you busy. He wants to keep you defending as much as possible. After the move e6, f5 was played. Now, this is interesting because now the pawn on e6 can be captured at some point. It's possible the pawn on e6 gets captured, and now black would be just 4 pawns up. Almost, yeah, four, maybe, yeah, 3 pawns up actually, 2 pawns up already, 4 pawns up. So, and another thing about the pawn on e6 is it could be a pest on black's position if black doesn't handle the pawn very well. So the move f5 was played, knight to e5. This is what I'm talking about. The knight is about to go to either f7 or go to d7. Actually, knight d7 wins the exchange immediately because the rook doesn't have any squares to move to. So knight e5 was played, knight to f6, stopping the knight from going to d7 because then you just lose a pawn and then white is up like several pawns, probably 3 pawns. So knight f6 was played, queen to c2, pretty much saying, I want to get one of my pawns back. I mean, we thought the pawns were not such a big deal, but that move is pretty much saying, I want to get one of my pawns back. I think I've sacrificed enough pawns. It's time I start getting some of my pawns back. But unfortunately, that queen c2 was not the best move on white's path. Um, yeah, I think rook fe1 would have been a better move. It's a more solid idea. So queen c2 was played. Black plays c6. This is interesting. Why? Now it's like black has a very big pawn on b7. But the good thing about it is these pawns are going to have to count at some point in time. Now, if white doesn't have a direct attack to get this king or any kind of plan to get some kind of material, I think white is going to have a lot of problem in this position. White is going to have a lot of problem. So black plays c6. The idea is to solidify the pawns on d5. So we have this very interesting shape here, which is so impregnable. There is nothing white can do about that pawn. So black is ready to give white back one of the pawns, the one on f5. But the c6, b5, c4, d5 looks really strong. And the good thing about the move c6 is black can always get a chance to move his bishop to c8 to try to capture that pawn that is on e6. So even though he's giving up the pawn on f5, I think he has some plans to get the pawn on e6. So let's keep going. Queen takes f5, queen to e8. What's the point of queen to e8? Let's see. Queen h5 could be a possibility. What's the point of queen h5? Just exchanging pieces. I mean, still up 2 pawns. So queen to e8, knight f7, bishop c8. Now this is what I was talking about. The pawn on d5 is defended. Now there is pressure on the pawn on e6. So white has to look for ways to try to do something about that pawn. So rook e1, good, makes sense, makes a lot of sense. There's an x-ray, or should we say an indirect defense on the pawn on e6. So after rook f e1, knight to b7. What's the point of knight b7? Knight, let's see, knight here is possible. Knight to c5. If bishop captures, bishop captures. That's a possible move. And of course, another reason why knight there, knight d8 is also a possible move. What's the point? Getting rid of this very annoying knight on f7. And it's important that we actually move the knight to, we're trying to find somewhere to move this knight, even though the engine doesn't really agree with the move right away. But I mean, this is a human move. You look for pieces that are not doing anything and try to get them in the game as soon as possible so they could do something. The engine was actually suggesting instead of the knight to a to b7, the engine was suggesting rook takes. I really like that move. I mentioned earlier at some point in time, black can actually give up some material to make sure that it has this overwhelming advantage. This is an interesting move because if it captures here, captures the queen, no, sorry, just capture the pawn. I don't think you even need to take, just capture the pawn. Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pawns to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2. I don't think it's so bad. But the problem is these pawns are going to really give white a lot of problems. So let's go back to what happened in the game. So in the game, knight a5, knight b7 was played, bishop to g5, rook to a7, and I think the idea of this is to defend the second rank. And of course, the rook is not really doing anything on a8. And you don't want to move the rook to b8 because it can just get chased back with the bishop on f4. So rook a7 makes a lot of sense. You're not just getting moving your rook to spend the second rank. You're also trying to get this rook active somehow. So bishop f6, bishop takes on f6, bishop takes pawn, bishop takes pawn on d5. That's a sacrifice, but there has to be a reason why black white gives up that um, piece. Pawn takes, knight takes. So now let's take stock. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces for black. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces for white. Now this is the interesting thing. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns. White has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So pretty much same number of pawns, but now black is just up a piece. So what does white have for that piece? What does white have for that piece? Yeah, there's still a lot of pressure. For example, knight takes is a very strong move. If pawn captures, um, rook here is a very strong move. Threatening rook check. Yeah, rook here is a very strong move. Threatening rook check. Queen takes check is mate. So like I said earlier, Brack is a very aggressive player. He's just gonna keep coming at you. So um, so after bishop to f6, a knight takes, bishop goes to e7, queen queen to g4, knight knight moves to d8. Now the idea of knight d8, I think, is just to still try to get rid of this um, annoying knight on f5. It's going to try to get rid of that annoying knight on f5. So knight captures, bishop captures back, queen to d4, threatening the rook on a7. So let's take stock again. White has 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns. White has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So a piece for a pawn. So the question is, what does black have? I mean, what does white have for being a piece down? The position looks very intimidating, like the two rooks on the open file, the strong pawn on e6, the very active knight on d5. But what does white get from this? Let's keep going. Rook b7, just moving away from the attack from the queen, and rook to e4. What are the possible moves? Probably maybe to double the rooks on the e-file and just keep pushing the pawn. That's a good one. And if you could get the pawn all the way to e7, you could at some point in time, switch his pieces to the king side. Now you can't come to g4 because the bishop is looking there. If you go to h4, you're not really doing much unless you want to bring your queen to e4 to try to mate on h7. So I don't know what Prague is going to get out of this. I really don't see any kind of compensation for white in this position. So let's keep going. Bishop to f6, queen to e3, trying to keep the pressure on. So bishop goes back to e7, h4. Now, looking at the position, the knight, the rooks, the queen, I think they pretty much maxed out what they can do. That means they're all already doing something. So what else to do? Try to get in some reinforcements. What other reinforcements than the really, really lowly pawns, which can be very annoying at some point. Now, with the pawns coming in the game, the pawns tend to do one or several things. Number one, with the pawns on the board, it actually limits the movement of the other opponent's pieces. Yes, it can limit the movement of the opponent's pieces. And of course, apart from limiting the pieces, it can also become an annoying, um, it could become an annoying obstacle, let's say, when it gets to a very sensitive point in black's position. So let's see how Prague was able to make this pawn h4 work. So queen to c6, threatening nothing. Oh, well, is it threatening? Not really. Not really threatening much. But Rook f6 with the idea of bishop here might be a possibility. So h5. Now this is what I said. The pawn just gonna keep moving, and like at some point in time, the pawn can be annoying to black. But this h5 move just doesn't do anything. And like I said, you really can't blame white right now because, like I said, all your other pieces are maxed up. You really can't do more than what they're doing right now. And the only other things you can use are your pawns. But now, just moving the pawns, like the h5 was actually given a very bad report by the engine. After h5, it says black is just winning -4. So what is white going to do? Now, this is the reason why when you sack a piece or when you sack material, you must make sure you know exactly what you're getting from it. So let's keep going. Um, bishop to bishop to c5, putting pressure on the queen and the pawn on f2. Queen goes to g5. Very aggressive move. Oh, there's going to lose the pawn, but I don't think it's a big deal. So bishop takes e6. I think that's a nice move. Bishop takes e6. Now let's take stock again. I like taking stock, so I know what I have, what I don't, and then what I can play for. So now black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns to white 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but black is up a piece. So the question is, what does white have for that piece? I don't see anything, to be honest with you. I don't really see, because white doesn't really have any attack on the black king. You don't have any attack on the black king. You don't have any control or whatsoever anything to do with black's position that could be threatening. Actually, I think you should be a little worried because of the bishops. The bishops can be very annoying. And if this rook on b7 gets into the game with rook b to f7, black should be, I mean, white should be ready to just call it a day. So h6, still trying to make something work. This happens a lot amongst chess players. Even when there is nothing, you're just going to keep moving, hoping. The word is hope, hoping something happens. You know. So rook takes f7, very 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 nice move. So black here is pretty much saying I want to um, end this game real quickly. It's threatening, of course, a very deadly discovered check, which just pretty much crushes black's position. And after the move, excuse me, and after the move, rook takes f2. Um, Prague resigned because there is nothing else to do. You know, there is no mate thread here. If you move the king out of the way, there's just a whole lot of stuffs going on. You have to be worried about the diagonal here. And after that move, rook takes f2, Prague resigned. So let's go to the next game. The next game was played by Ikaru and Vidit. Now, this is an interesting game because Ikaru, I think, lost his way along the line somewhere. And I'm going to, point out where I think Ikaru went wrong. When you're playing, no matter how strong you are, no matter how good or whatever, you still have to play by the rules. If you don't, things are not going to go your way. Yes, I always say this, you have to know the rules to be able to break the rules. But don't forget the part of knowing what to do and what not to do. So let's quickly get into this game and see what happened. I think this was a Roy Lopez played by, yeah, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, knight to f6. This is the Berlin, I think. Um, the move knight f6 pretty much introduces the Berlin. For example, if white castles, simply captures the pawn, and d4, knight back, take, and we have, I think we have a take, and then we have a Berlin defense. So, but Ikaru says, no, I'm going to just go for the solid d3 system. And d3 is a very, very, of course, we know the Royal Lopez is a very positional opening, but d3 is even more positional. So there's a whole lot of maneuvering happening. So whenever there's a maneuvering happening in the game of chess, you have to be careful. You have to be focused at all time because something might happen and you might just not know it. So let's keep going. Bishop to c5. C3 is played. Castles, white castles, d6, h3. H3 pretty much says, I don't want your knight or your bishop to come to g4 because I don't want this annoying pain. So, knight to d7. This is a typical maneuver in the Royal Lopez. Black is pretty much just trying to bring the knight to e7 to g6 and bring it as close as possible to this king's position and just stay there. Like I say, I always say this: when you put your pieces on good squares, good things happen. And when you put them on bad squares, bad things will happen. So black is pretty much just trying to transfer his knight to the king side and just place them there, just see what happens. So d4 is played very, very logical move. What's the point of d4? Now, the knight just moved to e7. Now, remember that the knight on c6 was actually one of the pieces keeping an eye on the d4 square. So d4 makes a lot of sense. You're trying to open up the position as quick as possible. So d4, c6, nice counter attack. And bishop to d3. Bishop goes to b6. Now, I don't like that move. I don't like that move. Why I don't like the move is I would have preferred white just getting on with his development. Probably moves like bishop to g5 or knight bd2 or rook e1. I really don't, why I don't like the move is anytime you're going to ease the tension in a game, ease the tension. That means, let's say we have a number of pawns that are attacking each other and you decide to make an exchange, pawn takes pawn and all that. You must make sure that pawn takes pawn actually works for you. Because if it doesn't work for you, it pretty much is going to work against you. So your opponent just have to find out why that move is good. So I don't like that move. I think that's one of the first places Ikaru started to err in this game. It's not necessary at all. Just keep developing your pieces. So d takes e5 was played, takes back, knight takes e5. Knight is a pawn up. It's a pawn up. But let's look at this. Black has developed how many of his minor pieces? He has 1, 2, 3. So after this move, he's developed all the minor pieces. But one thing I always say is sometimes even when your bishops, especially your bishops, are on their original squares, even without moving at all, as long as they have a possibility to get in the game, you could almost say they are developed because they can make a move in one swoop and they're right in the game. So what about white? White has developed one, two, one, two. I'm going to say three. Well, let me just keep it this way. Let me keep it as simple as possible. White has developed two of his minor pieces, the bishop on d3, knight on e5. There's a possibility of the bishop getting into the game, and white has some possibilities of bishop getting into the game, and then we just have to develop the knight on b1. So let's keep going. So bishop takes h3. Now, there we go. Bishop, I don't know how sound this move is, but this is the thing. Anytime you want to, in a game of chess, anytime um, you want to go for some pawn grabs, you want to make sure your pieces are already developed. But what I'm going to say is, at this point, I think because of the pawn grab, white was a little bit behind in development. Now, bishop takes h3. How in the world will we think this bishop move is going to get anything? Now, there are some other things that just comes to mind. The knight on e5 is weak. So if we could get some tempo on this knight, how? For example, if g takes, there could be queen d6, threatening the knight. If the knight moves, there's queen g5, g3 check. How does this work? Because there's a pin. So all of a sudden, and remember the knight just went to e7. In two moves, it's already on the king side. So it's not really going to look good for white. So at this level, I'm this super grandmaster level, and I know these guys know this. You don't just go grab pawns, unless you have some really serious backup reason for it. So bishop takes h3 was played, knight goes to c4. Now that's a victory already for black because the bishop took a pawn on h3. The bishop couldn't be captured back. Now, knight c4 is doing a number of things here. Number one, moving the knight away from any possible attack from the queen. Number two, trying to get rid of the bishop on b6. Now, and I'm sure this probably might be Ikaru's thought process here. Right now, Black will have to get rid of one of his bishop, either the b6 one or the one on h3. And if he does that, white has the two bishops in an open position where it can be really effective. Now, anytime we don't have a lot of pawns in the center, the knight maneuvers are not just going to work. They cannot work. The knight maneuvers normally work when the position is closed. But the position is open. The knights are not the best pieces you want to have. So bishop to g4, getting to tempo on the queen. Queen to e2. Bishop to c7, moving away from danger. And of course, keeping an eye on the h2 square. Actually, if I had the black pieces here, sorry, the white pieces here, I'm probably going to move my bishop to g5 because I need to get a piece in the game. Now, let's take stock. I like to do this a lot of times. How many of what black's pieces, when I say pieces, I mean the minor pieces. Why the minor pieces? Normally in the opening, the middle game, you want to always make sure your minor pieces are best placed because they are the most important pieces in the opening and the middle game. Your major pieces, your rooks, queens are more valuable during the middle stroke end game. Of course, the queen is valuable at any point in time, but especially when it comes to the rooks. Rooks need open files to operate. So let's break down this position. Okay, let's just see who has an advantage and why. Black has how many pawns? He has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns. White has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns. So they have equal number of pawns. What about pieces? So black has excuse me, 1, 2, 3, 4 minor pieces, 3 major pieces. White has 1, 2, 3, 4 minor pieces, 3 major pieces. So major pieces even. So what about the position? How many of the pieces are developed? I'm talking about the minor pieces. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4 developed. White has just 2. That's a problem. So if this game starts going towards black winning, white losing, it's no coincidence. It's very important. That's a problem. Now, what about king's safety? Definitely the king on g8 is safer than the king on g1. Why? There is not a single attack on this king on g8. In fact, we have an x-ray attack by the queen and bishop on h7, which is defended by the king and the knight. Although anytime your king is defending anything is a red flag, you don't want that. But the good thing about this position is by the time this knight gets to g6, you might as well forget about the battery on the h7. So, but now, the only way we can get rid of the weakness on h2 is probably move the pawn to g3. Now, that will create a fresh weakness on the light squares. So, black is looking very good in this position. And if you give the position to two strong players, I'm talking about Grandmaster 26, even 25 above, they will probably, get the job done. So, Ikara played e5 here. When there are too many pawn moves, it's going to be a problem. Too many pawn moves, it's going to be a problem. Although, yes, does he really have a threat apart from the f6? Not really, because this is really taken care of. So now the idea is after the knight move, there's bishop takes, and of course, the wins a pawn. But let's see, what after bishop takes, king moves, where does the knight go to number one after the move e5? Let's see what happened in the game. Knight d7 was played, immediately putting pressure on the pawn on e5. So bishop takes h7 check, king goes to h8, bishop come back to d3. So all white did was won a pawn on h7. That's all white did, won a pawn. Okay. So what did black do? Black plays b5. What's the point of b5? Forcing the knight away from an active square. Black would have just simply captured and captured back. But I like the move b5 because it pretty much forces this knight away from. It forces the knight away from defending the pawn on, and also to not such a good square. So after the move b5, knight e3 was played. Knight takes e5. I'm going to say this again. We have 4 minor pieces developed. We have 2 minor pieces developed. It's going to be a problem. It is going to be a problem. So bishop to e2, f5. Now, apart from the fact we have 1, 2, 3, 4 minor pieces developed, we have a new major piece that is trying to join the party. We have a new major piece coming. We still can't say much about white's pieces here. So sometimes when a game is won or lost, we want to break it down to exactly what happened. How did a white lose or how did black lose? You want to break it down to know exactly what happened and what could have been done. So as we see this game right now, we could pretty much tell white is pretty much digging his own grave. White is not playing the best of moves. And I will go back to this, the pawn capture on e5. There are some moves that are not just necessary. I mean, if you could make the capture on e5 and get something out of it, excellent. But looking at this game, we could tell that capture on e5 hasn't given white a whole lot. Actually, it's given black so much counterplay. So let's keep going. F4, a fresh weakness. Why? Because the bishop can simply come to b6, pinning the knight to the king. We have a new weakness on g3. Meanwhile, these two pieces are still in the game. Not talk of the rook on a1 that has not seen the light of the game. And I don't think this rook will see the light of the game till this game is going to be over. So after each move, there are just more weaknesses created. Now, you know, these are super grandmasters. I always want to say that. These are super grandmasters. What's the big deal? You wouldn't expect super grandmasters to be playing like this. I mean, I'm just, yeah, you wouldn't expect it. But the thing is, when you set up some things on the chessboard, you would have to deal with it. So you wouldn't expect super grandmasters to be playing moves like this. But it's just about trying to stay alive. And I'm sure if you ask a Carol where you think it went wrong in this game, I think it shouldn't be far-fetched to say the capture on e5 was premature because you're not really getting anything. You're pretty much opening the position and then your opponent is getting the best out of that position. So let's keep going. There you go. Immediately he plays the bishop to b6. And this is one thing, when you play super grandmasters, they don't give you a chance. I mean, they don't even have to be a super grandmaster. Grandmasters just don't give you a chance. Once you set up that weakness, they're going to come after it. And now you cannot capture e5 because after f4, this is just crushing. Because now pawn takes is possible. You cannot take back, of course, because you lose a piece. And then the rook gets into the game. The bishop is already close enough to this king. The knight is already close enough. So there's just a whole lot going on. And it's just a matter of time. And white would have to resign in this game. So bishop to b6 was played, immediately taking control of the new weakness created by the move f4. So king f2 now, I say this all the time. Anytime you have to move your king, either voluntary or involuntary, you are already in some big trouble. Anytime you have to move your king, either intentionally or not, you're already in some big trouble. Because in a game of chess, you don't want to move your king. If you move your king, that means there's some problems. Anytime there's a problem in any kind of position, you want to make sure you have your officers that are there to help you out. If you move your king, that means you don't have officers to help you out, and that's a red flag. If you're given this position, blocking the names out, you would never assume or think these guys are this good when you look at their ratings. You would not, you would never think, oh, this is a game from a super grandmaster. So King F2 was played, Knight to D5. Now, anytime there is a pin, right? Anytime a piece is pinned, always attack the pin piece. I have a lot of chess principles I work with. Anytime a piece is pinned, always attack the pin piece. This is not just attacking the pin piece because when the knight moves to d5, the queen is coming to h4. So look at it. Let's take stock again. I like taking stock. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces looking at this king. There's about to be 5 to join. There's a potential 6. There's an X-ray. So this is not levels now. It's just a matter of time. This is just really, really bad. So knight goes to d5, rook h1, check. King goes to g8, captures on e5. And I always say this, when you make a capture, right, make sure you get something. If you don't get anything, your opponent automatically gets something for that capture. So now a piece has been captured. But think about it now. What does black have for that? Now we have 3 pieces on e3. We have the queen, the knight, and the bishop. And it's not so much about this e3. There's even the queen f4 is very, very annoying. I mean, it's just a matter of time. White just has to give up this game. So queen g5 was played. And one thing I like about the move queen g5 is not just about the pressure here, but then the other rook can join either on the d file, e file, or so Black's pieces are just swarming. This is a game I think if Ricardo looks back and say, you know what, I never really got into this game. I never really had the chance to do anything in this game. So King has to step back. What's the point? It's pretty much moving away from any kind of possible checks and maybe just trying to capture the bishop. Or sorry, capture the knight because of the bishop attacking the queen. So bishop takes e3. Why bishop takes e3? Because if bishop captures, we need to have the knight capture so that we have a double attack on the queen and the pawn, breaking down more walls in white's territory. At this point, really, it's time to resign. But of course, games are going to keep playing. People can still make mistakes. But at this level, I think it's rarely you're going to see that. So bishop takes g4, queen takes g4. Now, for every exchanges white was making, the position keeps getting opened up. Now, I'm always going to go back to these three pieces. Like you cannot have these three pieces here against all these pieces already in the game and hope to survive. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Bishop takes e3, knight takes e3. More pieces in the game. So queen e2, queen e3 check, queen g3 check, king moves, rook e8. Now the rook gets in the game. Rook d8 check. King has to come to c1. You don't have the c2 because of the knight. Queen to g5. Putting the queen in a very deadly discover. It's a really bad game. I mean, it's not just bad now. And this is one thing I say. In a game of chess, when you make a blunder and you lose a game, don't blame the blunder. Blame what led you to making that blunder. And that could be a series of bad moves. And I'm going to say this again. He carries in this position because of the capture on e5. A very innocent pawn grab on e5. Very innocent to the naked eyes. And I guarantee you, after that pawn grab, everything just went downhill. So queen g5 happened, b3, knight to f1 check. And after this move, Ikaru resigned because if the king goes to b2, I think knight g3 is just pretty just winning. Knight g3 attacks the queen, attacks the rook, and yes, like I said, Ikaru wouldn't. It's a game he never really got into the game. Okay, we got two more games to go, so let's go right to the next game. The next game was played between Nepomniachtchi Ian and Firuza Alreza from Iran. Nepomniachtchi, by the way, is from Russia. So let's go. E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6, bishop to B5, knight F6, D3. Now, the same system Ikaru played. Like, D3 is pretty much saying, you know what, I'm not interested in your Berlin system. I'm just going to play chess. Okay? Bishop to C5, C3. Now, C3 is always played. You got also castle, but most of the time, C3 pretty much discourages this knight from coming to D4, putting pressure on the bishop on B5 and the knight on F3. Just, avoided any kind of exchanges. This is a very typical and this is a very typical position, a very common position also. So let's keep going. C3 castles, castles back, D5. Now, this is also a possible move. So black wants to just get into the game immediately. D5. And the idea of D5, by moving the pawn to D5, the bishop has an opportunity to come into the game immediately, either through the G4 square or the E6 square. So captures on D5, captures back, bishop to C4, gains a tempo on the queen. Queen goes back to D8, B4, gains a tempo on the bishop. Bishop goes to E7. All this has been played before. Knight B D2, developing its pieces. It's very important to remember that. Sometimes you might just get tired of hearing that. Develop your pieces. It's that simple, but it's so important. If you don't develop your pieces, you're going to get in trouble. Knight B D2, A6, A4, discouraging the B5 because of A6. B5 just wins a pawn. Bishop to F5, putting pressure on C2 on D3. Queen to C2, protecting the pawn on D3. Knight to F to D5, putting pressure on F4. Knight to E4, I like that move. Knight to E4, keeping an eye on the F4 square. Improving the mobility of the bishop on C1. Bishop to G4, threatening to capture the knight and forcing mixing up white's position. White says, you know what, if you want to do that, go ahead. Now, why would white allow the bishop captures? Two reasons. Now, to me, looking at this, if, for example, if bishop captures, pawn captures, um, this battery is very strong. That means you cannot push this pawn, number one. Number two, the king simply steps to h1, rook comes to g1, and bishop goes to d2. We could just double our rooks on the g file. Number three, what if the king moves to the corner? Now, we can actually, from the g file, transfer our rook even to the h3 square. So what's going to happen is, even though blacks was able to mess up white's king's position, there's going to be no play for black. I mean, almost no play, because the position is pretty open and we have the bishops to deal with. And there are no simple targets in white's position black can just take advantage of. None. No targets at all. Yeah, we have the double pawns, the h pawn, but there is nothing you can do about this for now because white's position is looking really, really strong. So let's go back. G takes f3. So this didn't happen in game. Sorry. So knight b6 was played. Knight b6 is pretty much saying, okay, you know what? If you're going to allow me to take this, I'm going to make sure you don't have your bishop here. So white says, hey, you know what? You can have it. You can have if you want the pawn, you can go ahead and have the pawn. So now this is another thing I'm noticing in this game. Now, grabbing the pawn, you grab the pawn, you lose time. This time can be used against you. That's one thing you have to realize. The time can be used against you. So let's see what black did here. Bishop captures on f3. Pawn captures back. Just captures back. Queen grabs the pawn. Now, the ironic thing about this position is, for each pawn you grab, if you're playing against someone that has two bishops, for each pawn you grab, you pretty much open the position for the bishops to all even operate. It's kind of ironic because you would expect that yes, you up a pawn, but you have to also realize that by grabbing the pawn, you're actually giving the bishops more opportunity to cause havoc. So king g2 was played in this position, and the immediate threat is rook d1, trapping the queen. Yeah, rook d1, trapping the queen. I was actually thinking about maybe bishop e3 for just trying to get all the pieces in the game. So king g2 was played, and queen to d7. Rook d1 was played here. Now, how many times has that queen moved? This almost reminds us of what happened earlier on in the game. I think Ikaru versus Vidit. You can't just grab a pawn and then, I mean, these guys, they know this. But, that's one thing about human being. Sometimes we just want to try that and see what happens, even though we have an idea what might happen. But like I said, sometimes we just want to see what happens. But let's keep going. So Queen E was played. H4, very interesting move. What's going on here? It says, you could go ahead and even grab some more pawns. But now this is going to be very dangerous because if you grab the H pawn, the rook comes to the H file, there's going to be fire on the pawn on H7. So even if you end up moving your king to H8 so you can push the pawn on F5, you're going to have to worry about rook takes check and maybe rook check here mate because your king can go back to the G8 diagonal. Meanwhile, the knights on b6 and c6 are looking very, very looking good quietly on the c6 and b6 square. Looking very good, quietly doing absolutely nothing. Yes, knights are doing nothing. It's almost as if black is two pieces down. I'm going to say that. It's almost as if black is two pieces down because these pieces have zero influence on whatever is happening on this part of the board right now. And I don't see how they can get to the king side to kind of affect any kind of like defense or whatever. I don't see that. But let's keep going. Knight c8. Now there you go. It's almost as if well, that's why they are super grandmasters. Immediately they see a problem, they start looking for how to solve it. Because now the knight immediately starts to reroute itself towards the king side. And what we should learn from all this. So after they move knight e8, h5. This happened in the game Prague versus Gukesh. Remember the pawn Prague was pushing? But it's a different scenario here. Why? There hasn't been a lot of there's been pawn sacrifice, but in this situation, there is really not a lot of activity black has. in this position. There's really not much black can do. This pawn gets to h6 is going to be very annoying. Okay, and the g file could be used, the h file could be used as at some point. Now, the interesting thing is this king on g2 is very open. And I always say this, if you have a weakness that cannot be exploited, it's like you don't have that weakness. Okay? If you have a weakness that your opponent cannot exploit either now or anytime soon, it's like you don't have it. You know, not to talk, so always have that in mind. If you look at this position, blocking all the other pieces on the board, you would say, oh my God, this white king has to be in danger because there are no pawns protecting it. But even taking a good look at the position, in fact, you could tell the king has nothing to worry about because the most active piece, well, the strongest piece black has, which is the queen, actually has zero moves. The queen doesn't have any squares to move to. That's a red flag. Anytime you have a piece that cannot move anywhere, that is always a red flag. So knight e was played, king h8. I knew that move was going to come at some point to allow the pawn move. But I don't even think that pawn move is going to be anything white wants to worry about. h6. He said, I'm just going to keep pushing the pawn. Pawn gets to h6. You cannot take the pawn because bishop takes is just very, very bad. You have to push the pawn past. And if you push the pawn past, we have holes in the king side you have to worry about. All right, let's keep going. So g5 was played, queen to d2. Now, the queen has spent enough time on that diagonal, and it makes sense to move the queen off that diagonal. The reason the queen is there because the pawn here is being stopped from moving, but now the king has moved away, so this pawn is about to move. So if the pawn moves, there's really nothing the queen is doing on d2. So it's important we get this queen to a more active square. So queen goes to d2. Knight goes to d6, bishop to b2. Just like in the game, yes, Ikaru beat it. Now the bishop is going to b2. Why? Keeping an eye on this long diagonal because there's a king on h8. You cannot move the king to g8 because there's another bishop waiting for you. Your king can't step to the g7 square because there's a pawn waiting for you. So all of a sudden, it's not looking so good um, for black. It's not looking so good for black. So if black can find a way to just get these pieces in the game and exchange some pieces, he might just have some chances. And let's keep going. So knight to f5. What's the point of knight f5? There's knight h4 is possible, what else? Oh, knight takes h6. I don't know if you want to grab that pawn, but knight h6 is possible. And what would have been a better move instead of the knight f5? The AG says f6. Kind of ironic because if you move the pawn to f6 now, this bishop is just looking right, and the king has not a single square. That's a red flag. Your king cannot move. Your pieces cannot move. Your queen cannot move. That's a red flag. You always have to watch out for that. So let's keep going. Knight f5, queen to d7. Interesting move. Why is it an interesting move? Your king's position is weak. So you'd assume maybe I can try to create some attack on this king. But no, white says I want to exchange pieces. Does it make sense? Kind of, it makes some sense. Because anytime your king's position is weak, you want to make sure your opponent doesn't have the queen to try to exploit that king's position. But most importantly, the reason why I think this queen d7 is an interesting move is it pretty much is looking to exchange pieces because white's pieces are looking very good. And it has a lot of control over a lot of squares in the position. So if he can get his rook doubled on the d file, white pieces are looking very good. So, and let's see what black played. It checks, king goes to f1, f5. Very, very aggressive move. F5, trying to, and I think this kind of looks good for black, but time will tell. Knight to g5, knight to g3, sorry. Knight takes pawn. So black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pawns to white. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So black is 2 pawns up. Black is 2 pawns up in this position. b5. That's interesting. What's the point of b5? Forcing the pieces to not so good squares. White just wants to push the pieces backward. And remember this: when you have bishops, you want to open up the position. When you have knights, you want to close up the position. So it makes a lot of sense to just keep pushing the knight backwards. And after the move pawn push takes, there's always a possibility of bringing this bishop to e6 to grab the pawn here. And so being the 2 pawns down is not such a big deal in this position, especially having the two bishops, dominating the whole board. So let's keep going. F5 was played, F4 was played, knight to E4. And this is one thing I always say. Don't fall for the I capture the knight, he captures back. No. Especially when you have some kind of advantage. You know, you want to make sure that you maintain that advantage. The only time you want to try to play something aggressive or risky is when you're worse. If you're not worse, try to keep it as simple as possible. So knight e4 was played. Knight goes to a5. Knight really doesn't have any other good squares to get to in this game. Knight a5 was played. Bishop to e6. I mentioned that bishop move earlier. The whole board, even though the position it looks kind of blocked. This bishop is placed very, very strategically because now you cannot push the pawn, you're going to lose the pawn. And once you start losing pawns, you're just going to start falling. And another thing black has worried about is this long diagonal. Very, very annoying. So let's keep going. Queen to g6, and that move is a blunder according to the engine. Queen to g6 was played. Queen takes e7. You cannot take on e4 because there's queen check mate, and you cannot just try to drive the queen away because there's still queen check. Queen takes, pawn takes check, and I just move my knight away and just up a piece, just like that. So let's see what happened in this game. Queen takes on h6, threatening queen check on h1. I don't think it's such a big deal. Bishop to f7. What's the point? Queen. What's the point? What's the point? Stopping any attack on the e8 square. That's a good one. So after queen, bishop f7, queen check, king to e2. Queen attacks the bishop and also attacks the knight at the same time. Bishop moves away from attack and defends the queen. Sorry, defends the knight. Queen moves to, rook moves to e8, attacking the queen. Take on c7. Now remember this, white is a piece up. White is a piece up. You know, um, White is a piece up. Let's just keep that in mind. Queen to g4. This is a very interesting discovered attack, but I don't see how much that's going to give black anything. Black says, well, I still respect your move. I'm just going to move away, so I don't want any discovered attacks. The king, rook goes to d8. There's a pin on the bishop on e4. Pawn push, multi-purpose move. Defends the bishop and also threatens bishop check, followed by knight takes, queen takes check, and black is looking lost in this position. Rook captures, pawn takes. Anytime your opponent starts giving up exchanges, that no, they don't have a whole lot to do. So queen to queen to h3, another pin. You gotta always look out for these things and just defend against it. Now you cannot move your king to c2 because there's rook c8 pinning you can do that. But you have to do something about this pin. Oh, I like this move. Knight to g3, breaking up the pin. And I said this earlier. Sometimes when you're up material, you have to know the right time to give some kind of material back. It's like appeasing the gods to kind of tell your opponent, okay, it's not that bad. Let me give you some things back so that we can be friends back. So because the position is pretty open, knight is on a5, not doing anything. Rook is not doing much. It's a weakness. King is open. Queen is queen is kind of locked out on the queen side. And the moment the rooks get now, because for example, if pawn takes, this rook move is very strong. This rook is very strong. If the knight comes here, the bishop takes is very strong. And then check is just, and so many things are just hanging. So it's just a matter of time. The position is already over, but let's see how it happens. So queen, knight goes to c4. Of course, the idea is if you get a man, if you're going to get my knight anyway, go ahead and get it. You cannot take with the king because there's rook to c8. So you have to take with the queen, and then I can take that, not worrying about rook to h1 with the mate thread on or on h7. So queen captures, pawn captures back, pawn captures, captures on b5, captures back, rook c8. We've been talking about this move since rook c8. Here it comes. So he said, well, rook c, I'm going to give you rook h1, and that's one thing about chess. You always have to know the time to go for a counter attack, because if you just keep hanging in there, things might not go the way you want it. So queen goes to d7, queen to h7, threatening, putting pressure on h7. Nothing really threatening right now. Of course, this is also under attack. King moves to g8, moving away from a possible mate in one, because now we have the f8 square to flee to. King e3. What's the threat? Just king takes. King takes is a, yeah, king takes is a possible threat, followed by just king back. So what happened after that? Knight goes to d4. Bishop captures. And after bishop captures, black resign. Because now we have just the queen and the rook against the queen and the two rooks. And there is no way this king is going to get mated in the middle of the board. For example, if pawn captures, what can we do here? We can actually just move our king to d2. No checks. So we're simply threatening queen e6, queen d3 check. Sorry, queen e6 check. Exchanging of the pieces, and the game is pretty much over. All right, that's about it. So we have one more game to go through, and yeah, it's been a long video, but we got one more game to go through, and then we're going to call it a day. So this is the gameplay between Caruana Fabiano versus Abasov Nijet. Caruana, of course, the American, and Abasov Nijet from Azerbaijan. So let's get right into it. So e4, c5, um, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. They call this the, I don't know, the Rosolimo or something like that. Yeah, anti-Sicilian pretty much. White is not trying to go into any kind of main lines. White is trying to, well, I'm not going to say main line. White is not trying to get into any kind of open Sicilian for now. So that's the idea of the bishop to b5. The bishop b5 pretty much is saying, I'm going to play a close position and just see how well you understand this position. So let's keep going. Bishop to b5, d4. E5, a very committal move. Why do I say that? You're giving up the d5 square. So I can find a way to get a knight on the square. I'm doing really, really good, because that's an outpost. So e5 is played, castles, bishop to d6, d3. Now this maneuver is something I normally see and something I've played myself when I used to play the Snake Benoni. Bishop d6, bishop c7, d6, and then a6, rook b8, and just play for some queenside play. So bishop d6 was played, castles, knight f6, knight to c3, castles, h3, making sure no knight or bishop come to the g4 square, a6, bishop captures, d captures. Now, the plan of this position has totally changed. Now, it's not about occupation of the d5 square. Why? Because we have a c6 pawn. So we have to look for a plan for white. I like the fact of, I like this a4 a5, trying to make sure this pawn cannot move forward, because anytime my pawn takes, it pretty much divides these two pawns and the one on a6. It makes them a permanent weakness. So I also like, yeah, I like the a4 a5. Then I also like the a4 a5 coupled with b3, bishop a3, um, knight d2, knight c4. I like that maneuver. This is a very highly positional game. So you have to keep looking at squares where you can actually make some things happen. So let's keep going. So knight h4, rook to e8, queen to f3. So white is pretty much saying in this game, I'm just going to try to attack you, period. That is every move. You have to be able to look at a move and tell yourself what exactly is your opponent trying to do. So g6, now the first weakness has been created in the king's position. Well, the good thing is black still has his dark square bishop. It can always defend the dark squares. But the thing we still have to remember is it's still the weakness. So bishop g5 was played, putting pressure on the knight on f6. Bishop e7 was played, breaking the pin. Queen to e3 was played, protecting the bishop and putting pressure on the pawn on c5. Knight goes to h5, bishop captures, queen captures, knight goes to f3. What's the point of knight f3? Of course, apart from the obvious move of moving the knight away from danger, what other possibility does black have? White, sorry. White can also look to move the queen to h6 with the idea of knight g5. Now, if we break down this position, what do I mean break down the position? If we ask ourselves who's better and why, so we're going to look at the minor pieces first. Black has a bishop and a knight. White has two knights. Okay, cool. So what's the nature of this position? Is it closed? Is it open? We could say semi-closed or semi-open, but it's actually more closed than open. So that means when you have a position that is closed, the knights are always better. When you have a position that is open, the bishops are always better. So it's important for you to know the nature of the position you're playing so as to know the appropriate pieces to keep for that position. So let's keep going. b6, a3. That's an interesting move. And to me, a3, white is just looking to play b4, I think. I think b4, if he captures, captures back. It's interesting because it's looking to open up positions. Or if he captures, there's knight b6, knight a4 putting pressure on b6. It's interesting. It's interesting. Even if the position gets opened up and most of the pawns are on the light squares, it's still disadvantage black because you don't want to have your bishops on the same color of your pawns. That's going to kind of limit the movement of your pawns. Your bishop. Sorry. So a3 was played, b5, knight to e2. What's the point of b5? Of course, the idea is to stop the maneuver of the knight going to a4, putting pressure on the weak pawn on c5. So f6 is played, knight to d2. What is white trying to do here? Now, one thing we have to remember is the only active piece black has, I'm going to say the only active minor piece, is the knight on h5. And coincidentally, the knight h5 also happens to be a piece that protects this king somehow. Excuse me, protects this king. So after the move, knight d2, bishop goes to e6, trying to get himself active as well. f4 is played. What's the point? Open up the position. Your rooks are connected. Your knights are looking good. Your queen is well placed. Open up the position. Try to get some play going. Try to get some target. So f4 is played. Captures back, captures the pawn. Rook captures makes a lot of sense. Why? We're trying to double the rooks on the f file and then just put pressure on f6. So what are the weak points in white's position? Pretty much the pawn on b2 is the only pawn we could say is weak. Well, the c2 pawn is also weak. What about black? Black has to worry about these doubled pawns. I mean, not because they are double, because you don't want to worry about pawns that are doubled as long as they're connected to another pawn. But if you have doubled isolated pawns, then you want to be worried about those pawns. But the fact that those pawns can become targets very quickly. And the interesting thing about this position is the bishop can always have effect only on the light squares, but the knight can actually switch from the light square to a dark square to a light square. So that's the advantage the knight has over this bishop in this kind of position. It's still, I won't say it's totally open or closed. I'm just going to say we can say semi-open or semi-closed. So let's keep going. Rook to d8, rook a d8, queen to e3. Why queen to e3? Apart from the fact you're putting pressure on the f6, you're also moving your queen away from the x-ray attack from the rook, queen, Because anytime there's an X-ray attack or direct attack, you want to really respond to it. You don't want to have to wait till it actually happens before you do something. It might be a little late then. So rook f8 makes a lot of sense. Rook f1. Now we have the battery on the f file. The f6 pawn is the culprit. Now the interesting thing here is once this pawn moves to f5, it pretty much limits the activity of the bishop. So we don't know how black is going to defend the pawn. So let's see what black did. Black plays king to g7, trying hard to make sure that it doesn't have to move the pawn. Like I said, and these are things we have to note. Now, what white needs to do is look for the best square for this knight. Where can he put this knight that is really going to hurt black? So let's keep going. b4 is played. Very interesting move, b4. Now, the idea of b4 is you cannot take twice on b4. If you take twice, you're going to lose f6 with some very devastating results. Now, what's the other idea behind the move b4? Anytime you're playing against the bishop, right? Let me put it this way. Anytime you're playing against the bishop with a light square bishop, put your pawns on the dark squares. By putting your pawns on the dark squares, you fix the dark square. That means you have control over the dark squares. Now the bishop is going to have a lot of problem moving on the light squares because its pawns are on the light squares. And the pawns can be easy targets. So b4 makes a lot of sense here for white. Making sure you cannot play a5. Okay. And if pawn takes back, you cannot play c5 because I have control over that. So let's keep going. Another thing is, if, for example, if captures this, we have this very strong move. We have this very strong move. This is just this is just crazy, man. This is just crazy because pawn here, rook here is just going to crush. I think I like rook takes because then I have knight here, knight here. So this is just crazy. So let's go back. So looking at this position, equal number of pieces, equal number of pawns and everything. But somebody is just better. No matter how much slightly, someone is better. Somebody is doing better. So b4 was played, captures back, rook to a8. Makes a lot of sense. Trying to create some play. You want to open up the position. You don't want to just sit there and do nothing. You have to do something. Rook a8 was played, and king h1. I don't know why the king h1 was played. Okay. Probably trying to avoid, sorry, excuse me, trying to avoid queen a7 trading pieces. I don't know why people don't like to use their pieces. Just use your pieces now. Why do you want to exchange queens? Use your pieces. So king h1, a5 was played, captures. Oh, c5 was played. Interesting in between moves. c5 was played. Now rook a1 defends the pawn. Rook a6. The idea is to put pressure on the pawn. And eventually probably bring the queen to d8, put pressure. Because you always have to keep an eye on f6. D e5. I like that move. Why do I like that move? Now, you cannot capture here because rook takes is very good. Okay. And if you push the pawn, just like I said earlier, when you have a light square bishop and most of your pawns on the light square, it's going to be trouble for you. So let's see what black did here. It pushes the pawn, okay? And c4. c4 is played, captures with the pawn, not the knight. Of course, you can't capture the knight because you lose the pawn. So not the knight. Now, this bishop can really do a lot of movement. The square on f6 is weak. So black has to always keep an eye on the f6 square. Okay. And of course, the bishop on e6 can be a target very quickly. So let's keep going. Rook a8, rook f to a8, threatening to win a pawn. Knight b3, defending the pawn, threatening to win his own pawn. Now, bishop c4 doesn't work because the rook protects it. So, g5. g5 pretty much says, I want to take your rook. Queen to g3. This is what grandmas does. This is what they do best. There's a pin. You cannot do anything about that, and you can't put a piece in between. So what happens? It says h6, defending the pawn. Rook moves to f2. Now, if you capture on c4, I capture on f5. So what do you want to do? And if you captured my knight, I have queen takes. And I think I still like white's chances because after the rook doubled on the f file, it's going to be really bad for black. Although with best play, black still has some chances to stay in the game. Like I said, stay in the game. But things happen. So let's keep going. Bishop takes, rook takes. Bishop takes is a blunder because after queen takes b3, rook captures, double the rooks on the f file. The immediate move is rook check, which is very, very devastating. It's hard to meet that threat. So he moves the king up, rook f7. It's already too late now for black. And after the move rook f7, Abbasov gently resigned. So here goes the excuse me the analysis for the second round games on the open section. I hope you enjoyed these analyses, and if there's anything you want to add to it, it's welcome. Any comment, any observation, we would gladly take them and do something about them. Okay, thanks for being here. This is International Master Oladapo Adu again, and see you soon. Bye for now.